know that representation is fundamental to the practice of a discipline. Chemists draw, geologists represent, uh, fashion designers create patterns. So we often ask students to learn representations because those will be the representations they will need when they finish their studies. And sometimes we're using representations to engage interest, motivation, curiosity. But there are some bad reasons, I think. So I don't think we want to say, let's use multiple representations because children have different learning styles. So we need to match to the needs of a visual learner, a verbal learner, or a kinesthetic learner. There is no good evidence for that statement. So I don't think that's a good reason to use multiple representations. And as I've already said, I don't think it's a good idea to have these general principles that you should always use text and pictures together because learning is better. Sometimes it will be, but I'm always going to say it depends. For me, this is how I think about it. I think about, are we using more than one representation because it has a complementary role? So we know that tables are brilliant, for example, for precision and read off, but they're not very good for extrapolation and perceptual processes. We know equations are a really compact, elegant way of expressing an idea, but a graph will bring a new understanding to that equation. So sometimes we want them because they have different roles. But an opposite, but another good reason, is sometimes we want to have multiple representations because we're trying to have less. And what we're trying to have less of is misunderstanding. So if you were to work in science education, one of the things we know is that children always misunderstand a velocity time graph, and that a straight line on a velocity time graph means no motion. But what it actually means is no acceleration. But if we combine a moving straight line graph with a moving simulation, children are less likely to misinterpret the graph. So we constrain them away from misunderstanding. And finally, sometimes I think by having multiple representations, we understand something about the phenomena more deeply. If you think about something like a quadratic equation, when you can see that it describes the area of a square, you might come to a deep and new understanding of something like an abstract symbolic representation. So my third thing I've learned is to design for developing learners. So learners are faced with learning the representations as well as learning through the representations. And sometimes as teachers or experts, we don't see the challenge in the representations we give to learners. So I'm going to return to that textbook I showed you at the beginning, but this time I'm just going to focus in on this little diagram that's over in the corner. And it's called the human life cycle. And I think everybody in this room fully understands what this representation is trying to help children understand about the human life cycle. But I'm going to pretend I'm from Mars for a minute, and I'm going to read it out to you as if we didn't understand what it means, and we're trying to understand the human life cycle from this diagram. And I think we could say, a fertilized egg cell turns into a baby, that turns into a toddler, that turns into a boy, that turns into an adolescent girl, that turns into an adult man. Now, that isn't the human life cycle. That's a bit closer to the parrotfish life cycle. But we only know that because we already understand what this representation is showing us. But if you're a learner trying to understand something for the first time, you're quite likely not to understand it correctly. And we can see this throughout our textbooks, experts and textbook designers, and on our PowerPoint slides. They don't see that it's hard to learn from the representation unless you already understand what the concept is. Another thing we know is that translating between representations is a very powerful tool for learning, but very, very difficult. So does this graph represent this equation? Does this phase plot of a predator-prey relationship describe the same relationship as this we're seeing on this field time graph? This is a very, very challenging thing for learners. So when I'm talking about the benefits of multiple representations, I am remembering that it's very difficult when you've got lots and lots of representations, because for each one of these representations, you've got to understand its properties. There's no point me showing you a phase plot if you don't know how to read a phase plot. You've got to understand the relationship between that representation and the domain. If I were to say to you, here is a velocity time graph, find me distance traveled, could you do that? Would you be looking at the gradient? Would you be looking at the final point? Would you be looking at the area under the graph? And as my previous slide shows, you often need to translate between representations. And this goes back even to when we're teaching children to read from picture books. We put picture books in that help them understand the language, but actually does it because they don't know if it's a picture of a cat on a rug, whether the phrase "the cat on the rug" is referring to the whiskers on the cat or the cat. It's only again because we can read that we understand what it's trying to show us. Sometimes we need to select representations, and sometimes in a theme I'll come back to right at the end, we need to construct our own or draw our own representations. So we need to draw, we need to write, we need to gesture. And I think that's because the goal of quality education is to develop something that I would call representational competence. So I think the goal is, particularly again in the professional practices of science, that learners should be able to understand, apply, explain, critique, and even invent representations. In other words, they should be reasoning with representations. And whether you follow Russell and Cosma's approach that looks at it from a domain perspective, so understanding, for example, the representations of chemistry, or whether you follow DeSesse's approach, which says in general, we should understand how representations work, I still think we have to focus on helping students learn with and through representations, because learning with representations is always intertwined. We're learning to understand representations, to understand new concepts, new forms of representation, and representational practices. My next theme is we should design for embodied cognitive, emotional, I would call it affective, and social processes, always working in a cultural context, always being aware of local wisdom. So I've got about a 6-hour talk on this slide, but it's early for me, it's later in the day for you, and we don't have 6 hours. So I'm not going to talk about every single thing on this slide. There is lots and lots of research you can find on the cognitive aspects of representation. So you can find many, many papers that look at how memory and perception, for example, are supported or are needed when we're looking to understand how people learn with representation. So I thought, well, we don't have much time, so I'll just pick a couple of boxes from this diagram where we don't always think about when we're thinking about design. So I'm just going to pick on the word affective, so emotional processes, and I'm going to pick on the word social and think about how designing for representation should take in that part of learning. So let's go back to my page from my textbook, but let's have a look at a different part of that textbook now. And here is a photograph of ecologist Colin Plant. Now, for many of you, English is not your first language. And so that possibly seems like a reasonable photograph to put in. You're probably thinking, there's something very important about that man. And that's why we're showing a child a picture of that man and making them spend some of their learning time focusing on this picture. But that isn't why that photograph is there. That photograph is there because Colin Plant has a funny name because he's an ecologist. Ecology Plant. There's nothing relevant about that photograph to what the children are trying to learn. So we're just putting it in to entertain. But children don't know that. There are other pictures, as we've seen on that slide, that take a lot of focus and a lot of attention. So I don't think we should just design for amusement. We should design for serious amusement. And here's a different example from some of my work quite a long time ago now. So this is a game to teach young children about multiplication and division. And of course, one of the things about multiplication and division is you have to practice it a lot to get it fluid and automated. But children don't like practicing multiplication to be fluid and automated. So we designed a game. And in the game, there's this hero called Matrices. And Matrices wanders a dungeon where he's been imprisoned, and he has to fight these zombie skeletons that are coming towards him. Now, you all know, because you're an adult, that if you try and divide 6 by 5, you will not get a whole number. But for children, they need to learn that. So what Matrices does is he picks up this shield of 3 and uses it for a tiny little simulated bloodless battle with a zombie skeleton. If he beats the zombie skeleton, it divides, and he sees the 2 quotients of 3. The same for 9. So he explores this dungeon with different zombies, with different numbers, with different things that he's engaging with them with. The zombies come towards him as he gets more experienced. He gets faster. He has to become faster. And what I would say is what we're doing here is we're doing serious fun. So we've taken seriously the idea that motivation and engagement is important. And we're designing a world, a representational world, which children explore whilst having fun. And our paper shows that children went on to learn a lot about division through this game, and they had fun simultaneously. So I think we should take seriously the idea that representations are emotional and motivational tools, rather than just put them in thoughtlessly for entertainment. And another theme I want to pick up is the importance of the social. So your conference title is also thinking about collaboration and collaboration through technology. And representations support collaboration and collaboration through technology amazingly. If you are working together, be it around a photograph, a diagram, a multi-touch table, you can point to things that you don't understand. If you're looking at a static representation of the cardiovascular system, which if you're looking at a picture in a textbook, you can gesture over that textbook to show the way that blood flows simultaneously to the body and to the heart and to the lungs, showing that the heart is a double pump. So when you don't have the words, or when the words aren't sufficient, you can use representations to support collaboration. And that's why I think visual representations become resources for social negotiation. They change learners' minds when you work together around a representation. And as I've said before, multiple representations are fundamental to professional practices. If you were to hang out in any laboratory situation, you would find scientists illustrating, arguing, discovering, communicating with one another through multiple representations. And as teachers, one of the benefits of multiple representations is sometimes they reveal misunderstandings that cannot be revealed from talking or writing alone. So they communicate with us as teachers what our students do and don't understand. So often, to take an example from chemistry, students might be using the word intermolecular or intramolecular correctly, but when we're asking them to draw forces, they don't draw the right ones. So they've learned the terminology without learning the concepts, and getting them to draw that can help understand. So there are lots of reasons based on the way that human beings think and learn to use multiple representations. My fifth thing I've learned is don't just design representation for learners, design activities with representations. A game doesn't teach you anything unless you play it. A book doesn't teach you anything unless you read it. So can we design activities which make the most of the representations? Because I would say it's actions and interactions with and through representations where meaning making occurs. So if I'm looking at designing multi-representational learning, I want my learners to talk about the representations. I want them to gesture to them and over them. I want them to embody them. I've done a study in the past looking at how learners can understand animation of fish locomotion by getting them to embody different forms of fish locomotion in their own body. Can they re-represent them? So if we give them text, can they draw it? If we give them a drawing, can they talk to us about it? Can they self-explain it to themselves? So can they explain what it means? How can we encourage them to observe really closely, relate what they're looking at to their prior understanding, critique? Is this a good representation of time independence in quantum mechanics? But we always have to beware passive processes. As a lecturer, one of the things I have noticed is if I show an animation or a video in my class, what happens is the students sit back in their seats with a kind of, she's ready to entertain me now. I don't have to work very hard. So they think things like animations, videos, virtual reality are here to entertain me, not here to inform me. So we need to beware hands-on activities where minds are off, or students just endlessly copying from the PowerPoints we put in front of them, because that doesn't help you learn. So finally, my last thing I've learned is to let learners design their own representations. So I don't think we should just give learners our expert representations like the ones we see in textbooks or on PowerPoint slides or on Wikipedia. I think we should let them draw their own, write their own, create a model of their own, sketch, gesture, symbolize in all sorts of ways their own understanding. So here's a couple of drawings that we reported in a paper in Science about 13 years ago now, of what young children draw when we said to them, draw what happens when you take your hand off a damp piece of damp tissue. So what happens in evaporation? You can see here that here are two different children, this one on the left, this one on the right. You can see that they've understood it in different ways. They've made different designed choices, but you can also see that they're representing movement around molecules using conventions. So here we can see a cultural practice has taken off in the classroom where all the children have learned a common way of representing. And that's one of the things we think has happened as we've gone from graphical to written language. Another thing we can do when students design their own representation is we can get them to do it before we show them an expert representation. So this is for me, advanced level quantum mechanics. I barely understand it. So I was working with physicists to do this work. And we were looking at quantum mechanics and time independence in something called the infinite well. Some of you might be physicists in the room and will understand this better than I did. But what we did was we showed them some simulations which had visual representations of quantum mechanics in them. But before we showed them the expert representation, we asked them to draw what they think it would look like. And the idea is they don't necessarily have to get it right, but by thinking it through, they're better prepared to learn when we then show them the expert representation. So they might be extending forms of previous sketches. They might be redesigning them. They might be combining them. They might be doing multiple things. And all of that is good if they are thinking hard about what a representation should be. So to conclude, this is what I've learned from 30 years. I've learned that representations are powerful tools for learning and a vital part of education, especially in the 21st century, as we move through time with digital devices using representations to communicate with us. We have to take seriously the importance of representations as powerful tools for learning. But I would say if we think of them as tools, it helps us think about selecting the right tools for the job at hand. You would choose a large hammer to crack this coconut. You wouldn't choose a screwdriver potentially or a pen. So we should always select the right tool for the job at hand. Don't just say always use pictures and text. Think about why you're using the representations you're using. And I would say the closest thing to a recipe I can give you is pick a representation, if you are giving it to learners to interpret, that makes its key task relevant aspects more accessible to the learner. Because learners come with cognitive, social, and affective processes, and we want to design a representation that allows them to use that. And if we're asking learners to generate their own representations, to draw, to model, we should encourage them to invent a representation that expresses their understanding, but provides a basis for going beyond that. So I don't have a rule, but I have some principles about what I'm trying to do in these situations. And the reason why I don't have a rule is I always work with disciplinary colleagues. If I'm working in art history, I'm working with art historians. If I'm working in chemistry, I'm working with Galoo, an expert chemist. If I'm working in biology, I'm working in biology, because I don't think you can have a principle for myself as a cognitive scientist without perhaps a version of local wisdom coming from the disciplinary knowledge of the people participating in the design process. Another thing the tool metaphor reminds us is it's only useful in someone's hand. A screwdriver doesn't screw a screw unless you're doing something with it. A representation doesn't help you learn until you're doing something with it. And it reminds us that we don't automatically know how to use tools. So representational learning is an intertwined process. You learn about representations simultaneously with the domain. And of course, if we want to let children use a tool, if we want to say, yes, you're ready to drive this truck, we should assess their understanding with the tool. So don't get them to draw and then assess only in writing. And so that is my thoughts about representational learning for quality education in the 21st century. So thank you for inviting me to participate in your ICOPE conference. And I'll stop sharing now.
All right, thank you very much. And let's give a very big round of applause for Professor Sharon Ainsworth. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we are going to have a question and answer sessions. But before that, I would like to conclude what our two keynote speakers have already shared with us. For the first keynote speaker, we have Dr. Farida Aryani, who shared us about the transformation from local wisdom into digital wisdom, in which in Lampung, culture and language, we need to preserve the language, and also we need to develop the language and cultures from Lampung. Dari Lampung tadi kita ada Dr. Farida Aryani yang telah berbicara tentang bagaimana kita bisa mengembangkan, membina dan juga terus meningkatkan local wisdom kita dari budaya, aksara dan bahasa Lampung menjadi sebuah digital wisdom. Karena sekarang dunia kita sudah berpindah ke digital, sehingga mudah-mudahan dengan usaha kita bersama, local wisdom dari Lampung kita bisa terus kita jaga, kita tingkatkan, dan kita bagikan kepada masyarakat dunia melalui digital platform. From Professor Sharon, we have learned 6 very important things that she has already shared in her experience related to designing multi-representation. The first one, Bapak Ibu, do not, please help educator design. Don't give them recipe. Second, in designing, we need to ask a question, a very important question. Why do you want to use this representation? The third lesson is designed for developing learners. So the main objective of designing the representation is to help to develop the learner itself. Number 4, design for embodied, cognitive, affective, and social. Because sometimes we forget the another two aspect, that is affective and social aspect in our design. Number 5, design for activities, not just representation in meaning making. And the last, let learners design their own representation. And what also very important sentences that is shared by Professor Sharon, choose the right tools for teaching and learning process. Thank you very much, Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen. Now we are going to open for question and answer session. I think we are going to open for 4 questions. But before you ask your questions, please mention your name, your institutions, and to whom your question is addressed to. Oke, Bapak Ibu di ruangan Zoom meeting juga boleh jika ingin bertanya. Di sini kita melihat ada Mr. Rian Hidayatullah, raise your hand already. And other please, if you would like to raise also your hand from Zoom, you can raise your hand. Yang di ruangan luring, silakan. Ya, Ibu Fitri 1 dan Ibu Miftah. So, Professor Sharon, we have 2 questions from this room for audience, and we have 1 question from Zoom meetings, which is Mr. Rian Hidayatullah. I think the first one, we would like to give the chance to Bapak Dr. Rian Hidayatullah. Time is yours, Pak Rian.
Can you hear my voice? Yes. Wait. Okay.
Cek.
Cek. Sharon, can you hear my voice? Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, pleased to meet you, Dr. Sharon Ainsworth. And I'm very delighted to standing here to watching your presentation, which is good for me. And my background is music education actually. And regarding to your topic about the multi-representation, I think is quite interesting for me because this is very philosophical question. And I've been searching for a lot of articles and discuss with my colleagues and the other scholars about this. So uh, I see that our student, especially in Indonesia, this is very uh, typical case in my student. I show my student to use social media a lot, and sometimes I think they think that way they can use social media, anything, everything is done. I mean, when they have Google in their in their hand or smartphone, and everything is can be accessible, so there is no requirement to more deeply or to searching some information. For example, like we did all the time to what is it? Reading articles or books or etc. and so on and so forth. So that's kind of thing that make our knowledge is more robust and cognitively getting deep inside to the core of the knowledge. So the current condition is the opposite of our expectation about our student related to the cognitive yeah, how cognitively our student to get some information to more deeply comprehensively learning on what we did all the time as academia. So I see this is the very serious issue. I don't know if in your country or your student, maybe you can share or comparing to our, so we can learn for your experience to your student. But however, in our institution, especially for me, I experiencing my student and I see a lot of cases in this situation of educational, especially when we talk about the digital realm, and then we can how we to anticipate and to what extent to overcome this situation when our student is trapped in a bad situation. If I can use the phrase, maybe trap in the sum of what we call like a cognitive bias, how we anticipate and to what extent we can we can we can compromise the digital our digital connection with our with the technology currently. So I think that was my brief question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rian. Professor Sharon, before you answer the question, we would like to give the chance for the other two participants who would like to ask questions. Silakan, Bu Fitri.
Thank you, Mr. Yanuar. My first question will be for Ma'am Farida. Pertanyaan pertama untuk Ibu Farida. Ibu, saya mengalami pembelajaran. Yes, sir. I'm Tri Eka Fitri from Magister of English Education. I'm a student of master degrees in English Education on third semester. So, my first question, pertanyaan pertama saya untuk Ibu Farida. Ibu, bahasa Lampung ini sepertinya tidak membumi untuk para pelajar sekolah. Kita dicekoki dengan berbagai aksara sehingga kita jago menulis aksara. Tetapi kita tidak mengerti bahasa Lampung sama sekali. Jadi menurut saya masalahnya adalah mungkin guru-guru sekolah perlu menerapkan model pembelajaran atau teaching method yang lebih fokus kepada speaking. Karena saat ini saya membaca artikel ada 70 juta pembicara bahasa Jawa, di mana kalau ke Jawa kita diajak berbicara bahasa Jawa, sehingga mau tidak mau harus mengerti. Dan kalau pembicara bahasa Sunda ada 40 juta, Dan itu juga bukan pembicara asli karena kita dipaksa untuk belajar bahasa Sunda. Misalnya menawar atau ke pasar. Kalau nggak bisa bahasa Sunda dimahalin. Tetapi kasusnya di Lampung dengan hanya 6.150 pembicara, kita tidak mengalami pemaksaan-pemaksaan seperti itu. Kita tidak mengalami kalau kita menawar pakai bahasa Lampung lebih murah, misalnya, atau kita ke pasar dengan bahasa Lampung, orang-orang lebih ramah. Kita tidak mengalami keunggulan-keunggulan dalam hal sosial jika kita menggunakan bahasa Lampung, karena di sekolah pun kita tidak dipaksa. Mungkin sebagai pertanyaan adalah, Ibu, apakah ada metode belajar bahasa Lampung yang mungkin menyentuh para pelajar dengan materi fokus kepada speaking, sehingga kita mengerti makan itu mengan, minum itu minum, rumah itu nuo, kampung itu anek atau pekon, sehingga kita tidak terus-terusan menulis dan tidak bisa berbicara. Bagaimana kita merumuskan sebuah metode sederhana sehingga ketika orang sekolah, orang belajar bahasa Lampung dan membuat Lampung diwariskan. Mungkin ini yang tidak terjadi di sekolah. Ya, mohon Ibu pencerahan supaya kita cinta bahasa Lampung. Masalahnya kita tidak punya stimuli untuk berbicara. Tidak diberikan oleh lingkungan kita rangsangan-rangsangan untuk bisa berbicara. Pertanyaan kedua, my second question will be for Professor Sharon.
Kamu udah
Professor
diberhentikan.
Sharon, it's a pleasure to hear your valuable and insightful materials about the multi-representational learning. For me, myself, as the master degree student, I'm struggling a lot to understand this concept because this is the first time I heard about this concept. None of my lecturers ever bring this concept to my college. So what I heard is, and what I get from the materials, when we would like to use multi-representational learning, we create our own image or picture in our mind about the materials given. And I think it is influenced by our mental knowledge, experience, or probably prior background of knowledge. My question is, as a teacher, how do we as a teacher designing materials that will be accepted with the different level of knowledge or maybe different level of understanding of the concept of our students? Because we have our own concept, we would like them to think critically. We would like to stimulate their critical thinking. But in another hand, we are not sure about their prior knowledge about the concept itself. How do we make it realize this kind of concept? So we have the same frequency with our students before we begin to stimulate them with the critical thinking. So would you like also give a very simple multi-representational learning in language, because I'm very interested in language teaching. Thank you very much, Professor Sharon. It's a very insightful representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bu Fitri. You have two questions. One is for Dr. Farida and one is for Professor Sharon. Now we have the third question. Yes. Introduce your names, where you are from, and to whom your question is addressed to.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Tabi pun, mohon izin buat Mami tercinta. Ini pertanyaan buat Mami kami, Mami Farida. Masya Allah, luar biasa. Jujur Mami, pertanyaan yang sudah lama dipendam. Yang saya melihat materi yang disampaikan, materi yang sangat luar biasa tentang budaya Lampung. Saya sebagai suku Lampung asli dari kecil sangat miris ya, merasa terpanggil dengan kondisi budaya Lampung yang hari ini sudah mengalami kemunduran bahkan kepunahan. Tadi sudah Mami jelaskan bagaimana kondisi dari mulai bahasa, budaya, sastra lisan yang memang penuturnya ketika sudah tidak ada maka mengalami kepunahan. Tadi juga saya sudah menyampaikan salah satu sastra lisan kuno, Bu Binti, yang hari ini sudah punah. Dan itu saya sampaikan juga. Pertanyaan saya adalah, di tengah globalisasi, modernisasi, kemudian banyaknya masuk eh, suku-suku bangsa ataupun transmigrasi yang ada di Lampung, ditambah lagi eh, apa ya, orang Lampung ini punya karakteristik menghormatinya sangat tinggi. Jadi karena sikap menghargai yang sangat tinggi inilah yang menyebabkan akhirnya saya pun merasa ketika saya bersuku Lampung ada orang yang berbeda suku, saya lebih menghargai dia. Akhirnya saya tidak lagi menggunakan bahasa dan sebagainya karena saya dalam rangka menghargai hal tersebut. Yang akhirnya ternyata berdampak buruk pada budaya. Pertanyaan saya bagaimana ini? Jika ada banyak tradisi maupun sastra lisan ataupun berbagai budaya Lampung yang hari ini mengalami kemunduran bahkan kepunahan, apa yang upaya yang harus kami lakukan gitu sebagai orang yang ingin bersama-sama gitu melestarikan kembali budaya Lampung, khususnya ketika kami mengajarkan di pendidikan di sekolah, bagaimana nih? Karena kurikulum tersebut juga terkadang tidak terdapat dalam kurikulum sekolah. Ada beberapa banyak budaya sastra yang memang tidak ada muatan lokalnya dalam kurikulum sekolah. Bagaimana nih? Apa upaya yang kira-kira harus kami lakukan? Mohon bimbingannya. Cukup dari saya. Saya akhiri. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ibu siapa tadi, Bu? Mohon izin.
Tifta, Pak.
Okay, baik. So we have 4 questions, 2 for Professor Sharon and 2 for Dr. Farida. But I would like to give the chance first for Professor Sharon to answer the question from Dr. Rian Hidayatullah and also from Ibu Fitri. I wonder, Sharon, if you have already got the question from Dr. Rian and Dr. Bu Fitri.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think the first question asked me, what do we do about the problem of social media and students' engagement with social media in a perhaps shallow way without deeply engaging with the ideas and concepts?
Yes.
So I would say, for one thing, as a species, we've been worrying about this problem for thousands of years. So if you go and look at the writing in ancient Greece, there is a worry that by using scrolls, students will not engage deeply with the ideas that they used to be able to engage in through oral history. And if we look through then the history of our species, we see it coming when we invented the printing press, and then when we invented radio and television and film and animation and virtual reality.
Yeah.
So I think it's an old fear, and therefore I think the answer sort of stays the same.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer stays the same in that students are very good at avoiding effortful engagement with the materials that we give them. We sometimes talk in my field about how you overcome the problem of passivity. So effort is hard. So I think while I'm not a huge fan of social media myself, I think the answer stays the same. We have to make it something that students critically and deeply engage with, that whilst they are reading social media, if we can help them develop the skills, practices, and activities that encourage them to critique what they are reading, then maybe in the end, social media can become just another tool, as long as we work with them to work effortfully with the misinformation they will often be receiving through social media. So I think it's an old problem and we care about it a lot.
So basically from time to So, thank you very much, Sharon, for your answer to Dr. Rian's question, the first one. And the second question comes from Ibu Fitri. It's related to multi-representation. And I believe that the question is more or less like this. How can we design material for different level of the students? Because in one class, maybe we have a very different range of the students who have the level of their English, level of their cognitive, and many different background that we have with our students. The question with multi-representation, how can we design materials that will fit for a very different level of the students? I cannot hear your voice. It's still muted.
I'm not a good expert on language learning. I do mostly work in STEM.
Okay.
But what I would say is representation here is our friend as well as the problem. So if we encourage students to express their understanding, so if we get them to draw, to write, then we can understand through their representation what their level of prior knowledge is. And that can help them when we then go on to show other things. So on the whole, experts, teachers, we forget the challenges of learning in this way, because to us, once we understand something, it's transparent. We don't see the problems. So if we get learners to represent themselves, we have a better insight into their current level of knowledge, and then we can adapt our strategies based on that rather than just assuming they are following us.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sharon. Hopefully that it will answer the question from Dr. Rian and also Ibu Fitri. Thank you very much. And we move to Ibu Dr. Farida. You have also two questions. Ibu punya dua pertanyaan, satu dari Ibu Fitri, yang kedua dari Ibu Miftah. Silakan, Bu Farida.
Terima kasih Bu Fitri. Ini pertanyaan menarik ya. Artinya sampai membandingkan gitu. Apakah kita harus melakukan pemaksaan seperti itu? Nah, itu dikembalikan lagi karena bahasa daerah itu tentu sangat berkaitan dengan filosofi hidupnya. Jadi orang Lampung itu kalau hakikatnya itu seperti tadi yang dicontohkan. Mengapa? Ketika orang Lampung berkomunikasi yang dicontohkan oleh Bu Miftah, berdua datang orang ketiga pasti berpindah. Karena tidak bisa dibohongi. Ada salah satu pilar filosofinya itu nemuin nyimah. Jadi ada anggapan pada penutur jati, saya harus simah sama tamu yang datang. Salah satu sikapnya saya harus alih kode yang tadinya berbahasa Lampung menjadi berbahasa Indonesia. Itu saya temukan data seperti itu. Nah, apakah itu menjadi ancaman atau menjadi potensi? Nah, itu yang harus diteliti. Ternyata ya pernah diteliti itu menjadi temuan sikap negatif bahasa Lampung. Nah, itu kalau dalam penelitian bahasa. Bu Fitri, jadi bagaimana? Sebenarnya belajar bahasa itu sama. Inggris, Indonesia, daerah. Belajar berkomunikasi. Jadi kalau tadi Bu Fitri menyatakan bahwa mengapa yang diajarkan sastra? Itu selalu saya katakan ini masalah. Tapi saya selalu mengatakan pada guru. Yuk mulai fokus pada penyelesaian. Jadi jangan fokus pada masalah. Lalu bagaimana menyikapi masalah ini yang dari tahun, bulan, sehingga kok kita masih di kemunduran. Tidak ada lain dalam situasi formal kita mengubah. Model mana yang lebih tepat? Saya setuju ada satu strategi storytelling. Jadi untuk kelas-kelas rendah sudah dibiasakan dulu. Misalnya ini hulu, sija, irung, segala macam. Itu terus. Kita tidak bisa bicara tentang struktur. Kita tidak bicara dengan aksara. Tapi dia melafalkan. Misalnya di pendidikan dasar, kita adopsi saja struktur analitik sintetik itu. Mengapa dulu itu tercapai? Ini Ibu Budi, ini Kakak Budi. Walaupun siswa tidak tahu bahwa ini Ibu Budi itu terdiri atas dari kata, dari suku kata dan sebagainya. Ini yang harus terus kita kita berbagi dengan para guru terutama yang di lapangan untuk mengajarkan bagaimana agar bahasa Lampung ini benar-benar menjadi alat komunikasi bagi masyarakat yang ada di Lampung. Begitu juga bagi pembelajar. Nah, ini sama dengan pertanyaan Ibu Miftah tadi. Selalu saya mengajak kita semua fokus pada solusi. Karena saya ingin bahasa Lampung ini lokal wisdom menjadi lokal knowledge. Pemikiran Bu Fitri, pemikiran Bu Miftah, yuk disumbangkan. Kita semua pengkaji bahasa. Saya tadi ngobrol dengan Pak Yanuar. Linguistik itu sebenarnya ada secara makro itu bersifat universal. Gitu. Tapi nanti secara mikro itu tentu sudah berdasarkan fungsi bahasa itu masing-masing. Bu Fitri punya pemikiran solusinya. Yuk kita mengajarkan bahasa Lampung ini untuk berkomunikasi. Saya memang mengundang di sini. Jadi itu barangkali jawaban saya yang sampai saat ini kita terus berupaya untuk tidak mengajarkan aksara tanpa bahasa. Tapi aksara yang bermakna. Jadi ketika siswa berlatih menulis aksara, kan itu menjadi salah satu capaian juga. Karena aksara itu merupakan bagian dari identitas bahasa Lampung. Jadi barangkali itu bisa dengan strategi storytelling, artinya siswa diajak terus berkomunikasi. Lalu ke Bu Miftah, ya kurikulum insya Allah belum disosialisasikan. Itu ada temuan salah satu dokter yang baru selesai menemukan kurikulum adaptif dan itu bercirikan untuk pembelajaran bahasa Lampung. Jadi Ibu inilah yang namanya local wisdom itu memang satu satu perjuangan yang tidak mudah. Jadi kalau Bu Miftah asli orang Lampung, ya beramallah dengan tenaganya mengajarkan bahasa budaya Lampung. Walaupun selalu saya ingatkan bahwa ini mengajarkan bahasa dan sastra Lampung dalam konteks keilmuan. Tentu itu yang harus kita kenalkan bersama. Jadi terima kasih Bu Fitri. Saya mungkin akan berbagi sama teman bagaimana kalau saya setuju itu. Saya kalau belanja di Teluk dengan orang Banten, saya ngomong Banten. Begitu ngomong Banten, harga ikan itu turun. Itu saya kalau orang bahasa kan selalu. Jadi sebenarnya itu konsep pragmatik kan di situ. Nah, apakah begitu bahasa Lampung? Tapi saya belum berani mengatakan iya karena orang Lampung punya ini sendiri. Barangkali gitu Pak Anwar.
Terima kasih Bu Dr. Farida atas jawabannya. Ini yang menarik Bapak Ibu. Coba kalau Bapak Ibu perhatikan, orang Palembang itu dimanapun ketemu sesama orang Palembang pasti ngomong Palembang. Tetapi tidak semua dari kita orang Lampung, kalau ketemu orang sesama Lampung, ada orang ketiga tadi yang disampaikan oleh Dr. Farida, memang kemudian berganti ke bahasa Indonesia. Kalau di Palembang, Ibu kebetulan beberapa waktu yang lalu saya ngobrol dengan teman Palembang, ada sense, ada rasa, kalau sesama orang Palembang ketemu dimanapun tidak menggunakan bahasa Palembang itu diejek. Ah sombong, udah nggak mau pakai bahasa Palembang gitu. Jadi mungkin rasa itu yang mungkin sesama kita orang Lampung, sesama orang Lampung pakai bahasa Lampung, mungkin itu juga akan lebih memaksa teman-teman untuk Okay. Prof. Sharon and Dr. Farida, there is a statement in Zoom which mentioned the learning of English and Lampung usually in schools focus on answering questions and doing assignments for tests. Maybe if you can have a few words and comments on that, because from the participants, it's mentioned that education, language, Lampungese and English, most of the time in schools, focus on doing the assignments and answering the questions from the textbooks. Prof. Sharon, if you have any comments on that?
I think Dr. Farida is much more of an expert in this area than I am, so I would like to defer to her.
Okay.
But I would share the concern of the speaker, of the questioner. I think it's a good question to ask, but I'm definitely not the expert here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Sharon. Bu? Belajar bahasa Inggris dan bahasa Lampung kebanyakan hanya fokus pada mengerjakan soal yang ada di belajar.
Ya, barangkali itu yang kita temukan. Itu yang saya katakan tadi bahwa yang ditemukan kasusnya seperti itu. Jadi belum fokus kepada capaian belajar bahasa dalam konteks berkomunikasi. Jadi masih belajar bahasa ya tentang struktur, ya tentang kalimat, tentang bentuk kata. Jadi sebaiknya belajar bahasa itu belajar berkomunikasi.
Baik, thank you very much, Dr. Farida. She shared her opinion about learning a language should be about learning how to use the language in communication context, not only learning the language for tests or for any exams that is available in schools and students need to do the exam in schools. Thank you very much, Bapak Ibu. Mungkin ini akhir dari sesi plenary session kita yang kedua. Thank you very much for Professor Sharon for your presence and also for your insightful sharing about multi-representation to help the students understand better in their learning. And before we close this session, I think there is a request from the committee that we are going to have a photo session. Professor Sharon, please be patient and stay there because we are going to prepare for the photo session here in our rooms. Silakan, Bapak Ibu, gimana? Mau gimana? Kita di mana? Kita. We also would like to invite our Vice Dean for Academic Affairs, Bapak Rizwandi, to come to the stage and we are going to have a photo session together. Hello, sir. How are you, sir? Thank you, sir. Come on, Bapak Ibu, ayo segera saja kita ke depan. Ya. Yeah. Okay, for participants from Zoom, can you please open up your camera because we are going to have a photo session together. Bapak Ibu yang ada di Zoom, mohon untuk juga berkenan membuka kameranya karena akan dilakukan foto sesi bersama. Silahkan, Bapak Ibu. Iya, di sebelah kiri kanannya saja supaya kita bisa Sama-sama terlihat. Ibu Ketua. Bu, ini Nita. Sini, sini. Sini aja. Yang penting jangan jatuh. Silakan. Okay, ready? Can we take a photo session? Okay. One. Ready? Okay. Big smile. 1, 2, 3. Once more. Wait a second. We need to take a picture from mobile phone as well. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Again, be strong. Yes. Come on. 1, 2, 3. Already. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bapak Ibu. Prof. Sharon, thank you very much for your presence and also sharing your knowledge and research findings. It's a very great pleasure for us to learn from you. Thank you very much. And Bapak Ibu, this is the end of our plenary session for the second session today. And thank you very much, Dr. Farida and Professor Sharon Ainsworth, for your presence. Thank you. Wabillahi taufik wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Prof. Sharon.
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu yang sudah ikut serta dalam kegiatan ICOPE 2024 ini. Untuk selanjutnya peserta maupun presenter akan dikirimkan melalui emailnya masing-masing terkait sertifikat. Nanti akan disusulkan Bapak Ibu. Dipastikan bahwa Bapak Ibu semua telah mengisi daftar hadir. Kemudian jika ada pertanyaan setelah ini bisa tetap berhubungan melalui WA group yang sudah kita fasilitasi untuk presenter maupun peserta. Sekali lagi saya mewakili seluruh panitia juga untuk kegiatan ICOP 2024 ini mengucapkan terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi Bapak Ibu semua dan sampai jumpa Bapak Ibu, semoga kita ketemu lagi di next ICOP selanjutnya FKIP Unila. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.